The following discourse delves profoundly into one of history's most pivotal junctures, the American Revolution. For those prepared to embark on a comprehensive exploration of colonial discontent, fiscal disagreements, and the emergence of a sovereign nation, this narrative provides a fitting journey. The chronicle of the American Revolution does not, in fact, commence in 1775 with the momentous shot heard round the world. Rather, this saga of colonial defiance finds its origins extending back several decades prior, when the rapport between Great Britain and its American colonies remained comparatively congenial, much like an estranged family unit that had yet to fully grasp the extent of its inherent disunity. One might conceptualize the British Empire in the initial years of the 18th century as an overly confident patriarch, convinced of his infallible wisdom for all his kin. This venerable empire had recently concluded a succession of costly military engagements, notably the French and Indian War, which spanned from 1754 to 1763. This particular conflict essentially amounted to an exceedingly expensive contest for dominion over North America between the British and French powers, with various Native American tribal groups aligning themselves with either side, akin to choosing teams for an exceptionally perilous game. This struggle, also recognized as the 7 Years' War for those inclined to articulate historical events with a sophisticated flair, fundamentally represented Britain's emphatic declaration: "We emphatically desire that France possess no advantageous holdings in North America." While the war's theaters of operations spanned multiple continents, the North American front proved especially brutal and economically draining. British military units, alongside burgeoning colonial militias, engaged in fierce combat against French forces and their indigenous allies across the expansive frontier territories that would ultimately constitute the United States. The conflict was marked by such noteworthy episodes as a nascent George Washington's inaugural foray into military command, which promptly resulted in his encirclement at Fort Necessity, an endeavor that yielded precisely the level of success its name suggests. Ultimately, the British emerged victorious, securing control over the majority of French North America. However, this triumph came at an exorbitant cost, a sum so vast it would elicit profound admiration from a modern defense contractor. The war had burdened Britain with an absolutely staggering financial outlay, a figure roughly equivalent to several $billion in contemporary currency. It is at this juncture that events began to unfold in a manner that portended ill, signaling an impending crisis. Britain, confronting its colossal war debt, then cast its gaze upon its American colonies, which had undeniably reaped the benefits of British protection throughout the hostilities. The prevailing sentiment was, surely these appreciative colonists will not object to contributing to the costs of their own defense. This line of reasoning appeared sound on the surface, until one considers that the colonists had largely managed their own affairs for over a century, thereby cultivating a distinctively independent spirit, much like adolescents who suddenly realize their parents expect them to assume financial responsibilities. The initial significant endeavor to extract revenue from the colonies materialized in the form of the Sugar Act of 1764. This legislation was, in essence, a revision of a preceding molasses tax that had been so pervasively disregarded it had virtually become an unenforced suggestion. The Sugar Act, while reducing the tariff on molasses, crucially ensured its stringent enforcement this time, akin to parents finally deciding to impose a curfew after years of lax supervision. Furthermore, the Act expanded the purview of admiralty courts, which conducted trials without the benefit of juries, a measure seemingly adopted by the British government under the misguided belief that the most effective way to garner colonial support was to revoke fundamental judicial rights. Colonial merchants, particularly those whose commercial operations relied heavily on what might be charitably termed creative interpretations of existing trade statutes, registered profound displeasure. However, the Sugar Act merely served as a prelude to the main event, the Stamp Act of 1765. This legislation imposed a levy on virtually all paper-based commodities, and when considering paper-based commodities, this encompassed essentially every item involving paper: newspapers, legal instruments, playing cards, dice, and even academic diplomas, apparently reflecting the British government's intention to render even the pursuit of education a costly undertaking. The Stamp Act mandated that all such paper goods bear a distinctive stamp, which had to be purchased from British officials, thereby transforming every colonial barrister, journalistic publisher, and card enthusiast into an unwilling agent of tax collection. It was comparable to a modern governmental decree requiring every digital text message to feature a specific governmental emblem, yet somehow even more vexing. The colonial reaction to the Stamp Act was immediate and about as subtle as a projectile brick shattering glass. It is important to note, however, that this response did not necessarily constitute a demand for outright independence at this particular juncture. A significant number of colonists would have been entirely amenable to paying taxes had they possessed actual, direct representation within Parliament. The fundamental issue arose from the British government's rejoinder to this entirely reasonable request, which amounted to a declaration of virtual representation, a concept as unsatisfying as being informed one is virtually nourished, while in reality experiencing starvation. Virtual representation posited that members of Parliament inherently represented the interests of all British subjects, transcending the specific constituents of their electoral districts, an idea that, while theoretically appealing, proved to be as ineffective in practice as one might anticipate. Opposition to the Stamp Act manifested in a multitude of forms, ranging from formal petitions and economic boycotts to more direct actions that would cause contemporary protesters to appear remarkably restrained. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine organization whose secrecy was comparable to that of a marching band, orchestrated widespread resistance throughout the colonies. Their methods specialized in what could be characterized as aggressive persuasion, which included the public hanging of stamp distributors in effigy, the ransacking of their residences, and generally conveying the unequivocal message that assuming the role of a stamp tax collector was not a career path promising a prosperous future. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty exhibited particular ingenuity, at one point compelling the local stamp distributor to relinquish his post beneath a venerable tree that subsequently earned the moniker Liberty Tree, illustrating that even revolutionary movements recognized the value of effective branding. The Stamp Act Congress, convening in New York in October 1765, witnessed the participation of delegates from 9 colonies who meticulously drafted a petition addressed to the King and Parliament. This document unequivocally declared that taxation without representation constituted a direct infringement upon their fundamental rights as British subjects. The Congress's language was remarkably measured, essentially conveying the sentiment, "We remain loyal British subjects, but this entire taxation scheme is proving utterly unworkable for us." It bore a striking resemblance to a meticulously composed, yet undeniably polite letter of separation, though the relationship had not, in fact, reached its conclusion. The economic boycott of British commodities that accompanied the political protests proved remarkably efficacious, partly owing to the pivotal role played by colonial women in ensuring its success. The Daughters of Liberty, for instance, organized spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, thereby reducing reliance on imported British textiles. British merchants, observing their profits diminish with the rapidity of complimentary refreshments at a university gathering, began to exert considerable pressure on Parliament to rescind the Stamp Act. The combined force of colonial defiance and British mercantile lobbying achieved its objective, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766, precipitating widespread celebrations throughout the colonies that likely involved more spirits than were strictly necessary. Nonetheless, Parliament could not resist asserting its ultimate authority, promptly enacting the Declaratory Act on the very same day it repealed the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act fundamentally proclaimed, "While we are repealing this specific tax, let it be unequivocally understood that we possess the absolute right to impose taxes upon you, however and whenever we deem fit." It was akin to a parental declaration stating, "Very well, you are excused from cleaning your room, but I want you to be aware that I could compel you to clean it if I so desired." The colonists, for the most part, largely overlooked the Declaratory Act, choosing instead to revel in their perceived victory over the Stamp Act, an oversight that, in retrospect, was rather like celebrating a single battle won while entirely disregarding the ongoing nature of the larger conflict. The period of jubilation proved ephemeral, for in 1767, Parliament resolved to implement a distinct strategy with the introduction of the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, who seemingly failed to glean any lessons from the debacle of the Stamp Act. The Townshend Acts levied duties on a range of imported goods, including glass, lead paints, paper, and tea. Essentially, these were commodities the colonists required but could not produce in sufficient quantities domestically. The underlying rationale was that these constituted external taxes on trade, as opposed to internal taxes like the Stamp Act, and thus the colonists would presumably find them more palatable. Furthermore, the Townshend Acts established a board of customs commissioners in Boston to rigorously enforce these new duties. These customs commissioners were, predictably, met with considerable antipathy, particularly as they were empowered to utilize writs of assistance, broad general search warrants that permitted them to search any building for smuggled goods. Such writs were so expansive in their scope that they rendered modern privacy advocates' concerns seem like disproportionate reactions to minor inconveniences. The colonial reaction to the Townshend Acts adhered to a familiar paradigm: formal petitions, widespread boycotts, and increasingly imaginative forms of civil disobedience. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer who evidently possessed ample leisure time, authored a series of influential essays titled "Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania." These compelling writings articulated arguments against the Townshend duties in terms accessible even to those without legal training. Dickinson's letters were extensively reprinted and played a crucial role in solidifying colonial opposition to the new taxes, thereby demonstrating that the written word can indeed be more potent than military force, although swords would eventually assume a significant role. The boycott of British goods during this period proved even more comprehensive than that observed during the Stamp Act crisis. This economic abstention was enforced through a combination of social pressure and more direct intervention. Merchants found to be in violation of these agreements might discover their names publicly denounced in newspapers as enemies of liberty, or they might receive visits from groups of concerned citizens who were remarkably persuasive in their exhortations regarding patriotic duty. In Boston, the relationship between American colonists and British authorities had reached an untenable zenith of hostility, a state of affairs so volatile it overshadowed even the most pressurized conditions. The customs commissioners, whose presence was universally loathed, urgently requested military intervention, thereby precipitating the deployment of British forces to Boston in October 1768. The very spectacle of uniformed redcoats parading through the city's thoroughfares served as a potent emblem of burgeoning British tyranny. This aggravation was only compounded by the mandated quartering of these soldiers in both public edifices and private residences, a policy that, remarkably, the British administration seemed to believe would foster improved colonial relations by compelling inhabitants to house an unwelcome military presence. The persistent presence of British troops in Boston thus created an inherently combustible atmosphere, characterized by incessant skirmishes between the military personnel and the civilian population. These soldiers, often receiving meager remuneration, frequently sought supplemental employment through part-time work, thereby entering into direct economic competition with local laborers for scarce job opportunities. This financial rivalry, coupled with discernible cultural disparities and the pervasive resentment stemming from a foreign military occupation, cultivated an environment where even the most trivial disagreement possessed the potential to ignite into a significant conflagration. It was akin to confining a multitude of highly stressed individuals within a constricted space and then expressing bewilderment when discord inevitably erupted. What subsequently became known as the Boston Massacre, a designation perhaps somewhat hyperbolic when considering the scale of the event, commenced innocuously with an altercation between a British sentry and a colonial wigmaker's apprentice concerning an outstanding financial obligation. This initial, rather mundane fiscal dispute underscored how even pivotal revolutionary moments could originate from prosaic disagreements over money. The confrontation swiftly escalated as an ever-growing assembly of colonists converged, pelting the increasingly apprehensive British soldiers with snowballs, chunks of ice, and a barrage of verbal abuse. When an individual within the clamoring multitude issued the cry of "Fire," interpreted either as a provocative challenge or a direct command, the soldiers discharged their muskets, tragically resulting in the fatalities of 5 colonists and injuries to several others. The Boston Massacre was immediately seized upon and transformed into a powerful instrument of propaganda by the radical elements within the colonies. Paul Revere's celebrated engraving, while possessing a degree of factual fidelity comparable to a contemporary political campaign advertisement, proved extraordinarily effective in swaying popular sentiment. The depicted scene misleadingly portrayed disciplined British regulars firing in synchronized volleys upon a gathering of seemingly peaceful and unarmed colonists, a stark contrast to the actual chaotic and fraught encounter. This incident served as an early, compelling illustration of how the strategic management of public perception could outweigh the unvarnished truth. John Adams, a notable legal mind, undertook the unpopular defense of the British soldiers, motivated by his profound conviction in the fundamental right of every individual to legal representation, regardless of public antipathy. His legal strategy was largely successful. The majority of the soldiers were acquitted, while 2 were found guilty of manslaughter rather than the more severe charge of murder. Adams later articulated his belief that this defense represented one of his most crucial contributions to his emerging nation, as it unequivocally demonstrated the colonists' unwavering commitment to the principles of the rule of law, even when such adherence proved politically inconvenient. Ironically, the Boston Massacre had the unforeseen consequence of temporarily de-escalating tensions, as both contending factions momentarily recoiled from the precipice of further conflict. The British government, acknowledging the counterproductive nature of the Townshend Acts, repealed the majority of them in April 1770, deliberately retaining only the tax on tea as a symbolic assertion of Parliament's inherent right to levy taxes upon the colonies. This maneuver was akin to pruning most of the painful thorns from a rose bush, yet intentionally leaving one particularly prominent barb merely to underscore a point. Consequently, relations between Great Britain and its American colonies entered a period that historians have termed the Quiet Period, though this tranquility was deceptive, much like the deceptive calm preceding a volcanic eruption. The widespread colonial boycotts largely ceased following the repeal of most Townshend Acts. Transatlantic trade subsequently resumed, fostering a fragile hope among many on both sides of the Atlantic that the acute crisis had been successfully averted. However, Samuel Adams, a figure whose unrelenting tenacity was legendary among colonial activists, tirelessly labored to sustain the nascent spirit of resistance. He accomplished this primarily through the establishment of committees of correspondence, which served as vital conduits for maintaining intercolonial communication among various radical organizations. These committees functioned as an 18th-century social media network, albeit one that disseminated grievances against British policy rather than trivial cat videos. The deceptive calm of the Quiet Period was abruptly shattered in 1773 with the enactment of the Tea Act, a parliamentary measure conceived to bolster the financially struggling East India Company by granting it an exclusive monopoly on tea sales within the American colonies. It is crucial to note that the Tea Act did not, in fact, impose any new taxes on tea. Indeed, it was designed to make tea more affordable for colonial consumers. Nevertheless, its provisions would have effectively crippled colonial tea merchants by enabling the East India Company to sell directly to retailers, thereby circumventing the established network of local merchants. This was comparable to a giant corporation deciding to eliminate all intermediaries, but with the added volatile ingredient of potential armed insurrection. The Tea Act also reignited the long-standing debate concerning taxation without representation, as the existing tax on tea remained in effect. Colonial radicals vehemently argued that acquiescing to cheaper tea would tacitly endorse the principle of parliamentary taxation, irrespective of any immediate financial advantage. This became a profound struggle of principle over mere practicality, a dynamic that frequently serves as the genesis for the most transformative historical upheavals. The colonial response to the Tea Act was both immediate and remarkably inventive. In several key ports, colonists successfully obstructed the unloading of East India Company tea, compelling the ships to return to Great Britain with their entire cargo. In Charleston, the tea was permitted to be unloaded, but was then deliberately stored in warehouses where it was left to rot, a protest strategy that perhaps represents the epitome of passive-aggressive defiance in colonial history. Yet, it was in Boston that the most dramatic and incendiary reaction unfolded, partly owing to Boston's distinctive flair for transforming political contention into highly theatrical public spectacles. The Boston Tea Party, executed on December 16, 1773, stands as one of the most iconic acts of civil disobedience in American annals, and notably, one of the most financially costly. Upon the arrival of 3 vessels laden with East India Company tea in Boston Harbor, the Sons of Liberty issued an unequivocal demand for their immediate departure without discharging their cargo. While the ship's captains expressed willingness to comply, the royal governor adamantly refused to grant them the necessary clearance to sail, thereby creating a tense stalemate that endured for several weeks. Ultimately, a determined contingent of colonists, some ingeniously disguised as Mohawk Indians, a tactic that could be interpreted either as a clever diversionary ruse or a rather insensitive act of cultural appropriation, boarded the ships under the cover of darkness and systematically jettisoned 342 chests of tea into the waters of Boston Harbor. Remarkably, the Boston Tea Party exhibited an extraordinary degree of discipline for what was fundamentally a large-scale act of deliberate vandalism. The participants meticulously ensured the replacement of a padlock that had been inadvertently broken during their operation, diligently swept the ship's decks clean, and even carefully returned tea that had accidentally fallen into one participant's shoe. They presented themselves as arguably the most courteous vandals in historical record, thereby demonstrating that even acts of revolutionary defiance could be executed with a surprising adherence to decorum. The British government's reprisal for the Boston Tea Party was both swift and unsparing, manifesting in a series of punitive legislative measures enacted in 1774, which the colonists collectively branded the Intolerable Acts, though the British administration preferred the more ostensibly neutral designation of Coercive Acts. These intolerable acts encompassed the Boston Port Act, which effectively closed Boston Harbor until full restitution for the destroyed tea was rendered. The Massachusetts Government Act, which fundamentally abrogated the colony's charter and subjected it to direct royal governance. The Administration of Justice Act, which stipulated that royal officials accused of criminal offenses could be extradited and tried in England, rather than within colonial judicial systems. And a revised Quartering Act, which significantly expanded the colonists' obligation to provide lodging for British soldiers. The Intolerable Acts were strategically conceived to isolate Massachusetts and to establish Boston as a cautionary example, yet they produced precisely the opposite effect. Far from intimidating the other colonies into quiescent submission, these harsh legislative measures solidified the conviction among numerous colonists that British policy had devolved into outright tyranny, and that Massachusetts's struggle was, in essence, a shared struggle for all. It was akin to a schoolyard bully targeting a single individual, inadvertently galvanizing the entire student body against them. The Quebec Act, passed concurrently with the Intolerable Acts, further exacerbated colonial unrest by extending Quebec's territorial boundaries southward to the Ohio River and formally guaranteeing religious freedom for Catholics residing in Quebec. Although the Quebec Act was not technically categorized as one of the coercive acts, many colonists perceived it as yet another manifestation of British oppression, particularly Protestant colonists who viewed the legal protection of Catholicism as a direct threat to their own religious liberties. The fact that the Quebec Act also effectively precluded westward expansion by American colonists rendered it even more profoundly unpopular, as few things provoked greater colonial ire than being denied the prospect of acquiring more land to the west. The collective colonial response to the intolerable acts culminated in the convocation of the First Continental Congress, which assembled in Philadelphia in September 1774. 12 of the colonies dispatched delegates. Georgia, however, opted against participation, perhaps concluding that caution was the more prudent course of action, or potentially just arriving fashionably late to the burgeoning revolutionary movement. This Congress represented a truly remarkable convocation of distinguished colonial leaders, including several individuals who would later ascend to the presidency, serve as Supreme Court justices, and at least one notable figure destined to meet his end in a duel with Alexander Hamilton. Though such details precede the immediate narrative, let us momentarily advance our narrative. The First Continental Congress grappled with the formidable task of formulating a response to British governmental decrees, while simultaneously clinging to a fragile hope for eventual rapprochement. At this nascent stage, the assembled delegates were not yet prepared to proclaim their independence. A significant majority still harbored sentiments of loyalty towards the British Crown, merely seeking an equitable redress of their perceived grievances. Their predicament mirrored that of a couple perpetually entangled in the same recurring dispute, yet unwilling to sever the bonds of their relationship. Consequently, the Congress formally endorsed a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, meticulously detailing the colonial complaints against British policy. More significantly, they forged a consensus to implement an extensive and rigorous embargo on British commodities, an initiative famously christened the Continental Association. The Continental Association distinguished itself through its unparalleled breadth and superior organizational framework when compared to prior boycotts. This ambitious undertaking saw the establishment of localized committees dispersed throughout the colonies, tasked with the diligent enforcement of compliance. These committees wielded considerable authority, empowered to meticulously scrutinize merchants' inventories, publicly denounce transgressors, and generally orchestrate considerable difficulties for any individual or entity perceived as undermining the boycott's objectives. One might liken their function to an omnipresent neighborhood watch scheme, albeit one diligently monitoring for the illicit acquisition of British tea rather than common thievery. Furthermore, the Congress stipulated a subsequent convocation in May 1775, contingent upon their grievances remaining unaddressed. This effectively constituted a precisely delineated ultimatum delivered to the British government. Regrettably for all parties concerned, the British administration demonstrated a profound incapacity for comprehending such ultimatums, a deficiency paralleled only by its equally abysmal grasp of colonial psychological nuances. Concurrently with the Continental Congress's deliberations in Philadelphia, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which had assumed governmental authority following the dissolution of the royal government by the punitive Intolerable Acts, embarked upon a systematic effort to organize militia units and accumulate military hardware and provisions. These crucial preparations were spearheaded by prominent figures such as John Hancock, a man who had amassed considerable wealth through illicit smuggling activities and was now channeling his formidable organizational acumen into the burgeoning revolutionary cause, and Samuel Adams, who had at long last discovered a grander purpose truly commensurate with his unparalleled talent for political agitation. The British government, acutely aware that Massachusetts was teetering on the precipice of outright rebellion, appointed General Thomas Gage. Gage found himself burdened with the unenviable mandate of reasserting British dominion within a colony, where the very concept of British authority was met with an enthusiasm akin to that reserved for a governmental tax audit. Paradoxically, Gage was, in fact, a man of considerable reason and possessed a more nuanced understanding of the colonial perspective than many of his British counterparts. Having dedicated numerous years to service in America, and even having married an American woman, lamentably, the virtue of reasonableness proved woefully inadequate in navigating a volatile situation that had long since transcended the boundaries of rational discourse. By the nascent months of 1775, both opposing factions were actively engaged in preparations for an inevitable armed confrontation, all the while professing a fervent desire to avert it. Their actions resembled two individuals locked in an escalating verbal dispute, each persistently denying any intention of physical engagement. The colonial populace busied itself with the formation of militia units and the accumulation of armaments, while the British meticulously planned operations designed to seize colonial military caches. This unfolding scenario epitomized a classic security dilemma. The defensive measures undertaken by one side were invariably perceived as offensive preparations by the other, thereby fostering a perilous spiral of escalating mistrust and burgeoning military expansion. The decisive spark that ignited the conflagration of the American Revolution manifested on April 19, 1775, when General Gage dispatched a contingent of approximately 700 British regulars with the specific objective of confiscating colonial military stores secreted in Concord, Massachusetts. The mission was intended to be executed under the cloak of utmost secrecy. However, within a colony where an intricate web of surveillance and observation permeated every facet of daily life, maintaining the confidentiality of military maneuvers proved as elusive as attempting to conceal a surprise celebration in a close-knit community. The meticulously woven colonial intelligence network, comprising an eclectic array of informants ranging from astute tavern proprietors to diligent stable boys, swiftly disseminated intelligence regarding the British troop movements. Paul Revere and William Dawes famously embarked on their rides to forewarn the colonial inhabitants. It is highly improbable that Revere vociferously proclaimed, "The British are coming." Given that a substantial portion of the colonists still identified themselves as British subjects, while Revere's ride has been enshrined in legend, historical accounts reveal he was, in fact, apprehended by a British patrol prior to reaching Concord, and was subsequently compelled to trek back to Lexington on foot, a detail considerably less dramatic than the poetic renditions suggest. Indeed, the intricate tapestry of historical events often proves far more complex than the simplified narratives we construct. The British column arrived in Lexington at the break of dawn on April 19th, where they encountered approximately 70 colonial militiamen arrayed on the village green. The militia, under the command of Captain John Parker, were vastly outnumbered and harbored no genuine intention of engaging in a direct firefight with the seasoned British regulars. Their presence was primarily symbolic, a gesture of protest akin to attending a demonstration armed with a placard, but devoid of any genuine expectation of instigating substantive change. Parker is famously reported to have exhorted his men with the words, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." a pronouncement that resonates with dramatic flair, though it likely served more as a pragmatic admonition to avoid impetuous actions. What transpired next remains one of those enigmatic historical junctures where absolute consensus on the precise sequence of events eludes scholars, a circumstance frustrating for historians, yet entirely characteristic of chaotic situations involving anxious individuals armed with loaded weaponry. A single shot rang out, the renowned shot heard round the world, yet the identity of the individual who discharged it, or indeed whether it was an intentional act, remains shrouded in mystery. It could have emanated from a British soldier, a colonial militiaman, or even resulted from an accidental discharge. What is definitively known is that in the aftermath of this inaugural shot, both sides unleashed a volley of fire, and once the acrid smoke dissipated, 8 colonists lay dead and 10 wounded, while only a solitary British soldier sustained injuries. The skirmish at Lexington, though brief and decidedly one-sided, possessed immense symbolic resonance. The British column subsequently pressed onward to Concord, where they successfully located and destroyed a limited quantity of military supplies. However, by this juncture, colonial militia units were rapidly converging from across the entire region, thereby transforming what had commenced as a routine military operation into a perilously escalating confrontation. The British retreat from Concord back to Boston swiftly degenerated into a protracted running battle, as colonial militiamen relentlessly harassed the column from concealed positions behind trees, stone walls, and various structures. The British soldiers, meticulously trained for the formalized European style of warfare, characterized by precise formations and open battlefields, found themselves subjected to incessant attacks from an elusive adversary they could barely discern. Their predicament was analogous to being immersed in a video game populated entirely by snipers, albeit wielding muskets that demanded an agonizingly protracted reloading process. The colonial militiamen, many of whom were ordinary farmers and skilled craftsmen with rudimentary military training, demonstrated a surprisingly potent efficacy in this unconventional style of irregular warfare. Moreover, they were fighting fiercely to defend their homes and families, a potent and generally highly effective motivating factor. The British column might well have been entirely annihilated had it not been for the timely arrival of a relief force dispatched from Boston, which intercepted them at Lexington and provided crucial cover for their arduous retreat. By the conclusion of that fateful day, the British had sustained a staggering 273 casualties, in stark contrast to the 95 suffered by the colonists, a shocking reversal of the anticipated outcome when professional soldiers clashed with part-time militia. News of the events at Lexington and Concord propagated throughout the colonies, with a velocity rivaling that of a scandalous celebrity exposé, conveyed by writers who, in their fervent zeal to disseminate the intelligence that armed conflict had finally commenced, likely shattered numerous land speed records. This rapid dissemination effectively culminated in the besieging of the British garrison ensconced within Boston. These militiamen, hailing from every corner of New England, arrived bearing their own weaponry, provisions, and a remarkably diverse spectrum of military experience, encompassing everything from seasoned veterans of the French and Indian War to adolescents who had never discharged a weapon in anger. It was akin to the world's most haphazard military convention, with the notable distinctions that every participant was armed and profoundly incensed by taxation. The ensuing siege of Boston presented both belligerent parties with unforeseen and formidable challenges. The British found themselves entrapped within a city, encircled by an adversary they had consistently and gravely underestimated. Concurrently, the colonists swiftly ascertained that the sustained maintenance of an army in the field presented considerably greater complexities than merely orchestrating a protest march. The colonial forces were acutely deficient in virtually every essential resource, ranging from gunpowder to proper latrine facilities, and their command structure exhibited a level of organization comparable to an impromptu pickup basketball game. The Second Continental Congress convened merely 3 weeks subsequent to the engagements at Lexington and Concord, confronting a dramatically altered situation from what they had initially anticipated. Instead of engaging in diplomatic negotiations with the British government from a position of moral authority, they now found themselves compelled to manage an active military conflict. It was akin to meticulously planning a peaceful demonstration and inadvertently igniting a full-scale revolution, which, in essence, was precisely what had transpired. The New England colonies urgently appealed for support, yet assuming direct responsibility for military operations would signify a momentous escalation, rendering reconciliation with Britain immeasurably more arduous. Conversely, abandoning the New England forces would almost certainly spell the definitive end of colonial resistance. It was one of those agonizing decisions where every available option appeared unfavorable, but inaction was arguably the most detrimental course of all. Consequently, the Congress resolved to formally adopt the army encircling Boston, thereby designating it the Continental Army, a title that, at the time, sounded considerably more official than the actual reality. Furthermore, they recognized the imperative of selecting a commander-in-chief, a necessity that precipitated a period of intricate political maneuvering. The selection of a commander for the nascent American forces was a complex affair, fraught with intricate political maneuvering. While logic might have suggested a candidate from New England, given that the epicenter of hostilities lay within that region, the Continental Congress astutely recognized the imperative of transforming this localized conflict into a truly continental endeavor. John Adams, demonstrating a moment of exceptional political acumen, put forth the nomination of George Washington from Virginia. This choice was partly predicated on Washington's prior military experience and, crucially, on the strategic necessity of ensuring Virginia's unwavering commitment to the cause, which was indispensable to the nascent rebellion's prospects. Washington's eventual appointment as commander-in-chief, though appearing predestined in retrospect, was in fact fraught with considerable peril at the time. His military background stemmed from the French and Indian War, yet he lacked experience leading formations beyond a regimental scale, and his most notable martial exploit involved a capitulation at Fort Necessity to the French. Nevertheless, he possessed an imposing stature, an air of profound dignity, and embodied the prevailing archetype of a military commander, characteristics that held a weight far exceeding contemporary comprehension. It is a peculiar facet of history that its trajectory can, at times, pivot on the most outwardly trivial characteristics. General Washington journeyed to Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, to assume command of what was grandiloquently designated the Continental Army. In reality, this force was a heterogeneous assemblage of provincial citizen soldiers, each unit possessing distinct and often conflicting notions regarding military protocol, hierarchical authority, and fundamental sanitary practices. The Army's encampments around Boston presented circumstances so squalid and unsanitary as to induce profound dismay in any contemporary public health official, marked by inadequate sanitation infrastructure, severely limited medical provisions, and a command structure that remained largely theoretical, lacking substantive practical application. Washington's initial and most pressing challenge was not engaging the British, but rather transforming this disparate, armed throng into something remotely resembling a cohesive military force. The monumental undertaking of forging an army from its raw components, while simultaneously orchestrating a siege, was further compounded by the reality that most militiamen had signed up for ephemeral enlistment periods, anticipating their return to agrarian pursuits during the crucial harvest season, a testament to how even the momentous undertaking of a revolution was seemingly constrained by the immutable rhythms of the farming year. Washington found himself perpetually contending with the imminent departure of units whose terms of service were expiring, soldiers who exhibited a marked reluctance to submit to the authority of officers originating from different provincial jurisdictions, and a persistent scarcity encompassing essential provisions, ranging from vital gunpowder reserves to crucial cold-weather garments. It was akin to the Sisyphean endeavor of orchestrating an extensive wilderness expedition for thousands of individuals, each possessing divergent and irreconcilable preferences regarding their ultimate destination. While Washington grappled with the formidable exigencies of command, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was wrestling with the profound existential query regarding the ultimate objectives of their burgeoning conflict. Many delegates still harbored fervent hopes for a peaceful reconciliation with Great Britain and were thus hesitant to embark upon actions that would irrevocably foreclose avenues for diplomatic accommodation. In July 1775, the Congress approved the Olive Branch Petition, which essentially constituted a final, desperate overture aimed at averting an irreversible schism with the mother country. This petition affirmed their enduring allegiance to His Majesty King George III, concurrently imploring his royal intervention with Parliament to address their accumulated colonial grievances. The Olive Branch Petition represented the diplomatic parallel to a wistful electronic communiqué dispatched to a former paramour, tentatively inquiring about the feasibility of sustained platonic camaraderie, a gesture theoretically conceivable, yet unlikely to yield the desired amicable outcome. King George III, however, pointedly declined even to acknowledge the petition's reception, and in August 1775, he promulgated a formal proclamation unequivocally designating the colonies as being embroiled in a state of open insurrection. This royal declaration served as the definitive British retort, unequivocally conveying a disinterest in any conciliatory overtures, thereby extinguishing virtually any plausible prospect of a peaceful rapprochement. The initial substantial military engagement subsequent to the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord was the Battle of Bunker Hill, though it predominantly unfolded upon the adjacent Breed's Hill, a testament to the perplexing nomenclature often associated with Revolutionary War confrontations. This pivotal clash occurred on June 17, 1775, when Imperial forces endeavored to rupture the ongoing investment of Boston by securing the commanding elevated terrain affording a panoramic vantage point over the urban center. The colonial forces, under the resolute leadership of Colonel William Prescott, had painstakingly erected formidable earthworks on Breed's Hill during the preceding nocturnal hours, thereby compelling the British to undertake an arduous uphill assault against well-entrenched and strategically positioned defenders. The British assault on Breed's Hill emerged as a quintessential illustration of strategic miscalculation in 18th-century military doctrine. General William Howe, who directed the attack, opted for a direct daylight frontal charge ascending the formidable incline, evidently operating under the erroneous presumption that the provincial citizen soldiers would precipitously retreat upon encountering the disciplined advance of British regulars in serried ranks. This strategy yielded results precisely commensurate with the inherent folly of assailing an elevated, fortified position defended by individuals whose proficiency in marksmanship had been honed through years of spirited resistance to British revenue agents. The colonial defenders, adhering scrupulously to the sagacious directive to conserve their ammunition until the whites of the enemy's eyes became discernible, patiently withheld their fire until the British were at dangerously close range before unleashing a devastating volley. The consequences proved calamitous. The initial British sally was decisively repelled, incurring grievous losses, a fate similarly befalling their subsequent second advance. The British forces ultimately prevailed on their third attempt, but only after the colonial combatants had expended their meager ammunition reserves and were compelled to execute a strategic withdrawal. The British forces, in a purely tactical sense, claimed victory by ultimately securing the elevated terrain, yet they endured in excess of 1,000 casualties, starkly contrasting with approximately 400 sustained by the colonial combatants. This was a Pyrrhic triumph capable of fiscally debilitating an expansive empire, should such costly successes become a recurring pattern. The Battle of Bunker Hill generated a multitude of significant ramifications extending far beyond the immediate tactical calculus. It unequivocally evinced the capacity of colonial forces to steadfastly confront and withstand seasoned British regulars in a pitched, open engagement, which served as a profound galvanizing effect on colonial morale, concurrently delivering a palpable jolt to British strategic self-assurance. Furthermore, it starkly underscored the emerging reality that the conflict would prove considerably more expensive and arduous than initially conceived by any party. General Howe is famously reported to have voiced a post-battle sentiment expressing his fervent desire never again to witness a victory of such a ruinous character, a pronouncement scarcely indicative of robust leadership or strategic optimism from a commanding officer. The protracted siege of Boston persisted throughout the unforgiving winter months of 1775 into 1776, with each belligerent contending with the formidable exigencies of sustaining active military operations amidst the harsh rigors of a New England winter. The British enjoyed a relative degree of comfort within the confines of Boston, yet they remained effectively incarcerated within the urban perimeter, precluded from venturing significantly beyond their defensive emplacements without incurring the palpable risk of hostile engagement. The nascent Continental Army, conversely, endured considerably less amenity, encamped in the rural environs surrounding Boston, beset by insufficient shelter, inadequate raiment, and a dearth of essential provisions. Nonetheless, they exercised dominion over the contiguous territory and could draw sustenance and succor from the sympathetic local populace. General Washington's most formidable obstacle throughout the protracted siege emanated not from the formidable British army, but rather from the inherent fragilities within his own nascent military establishment. The Continental Army was perennially teetering on the precipice of utter disintegration as enlistment contracts lapsed and citizen soldiers returned to their civilian lives. Washington devoted a substantial portion of his energy to a ceaseless epistolary campaign directed at the Continental Congress, urgently imploring them for vital provisions, fiscal appropriations, and the requisite executive authority to enforce military discipline. His voluminous dispatches from this trying epoch resonate with the exasperated remonstrations of a profoundly beleaguered mid-level executive endeavoring to superintend a commercial enterprise utterly devoid of budgetary allocations. Staffed by an unreliable workforce and governed by a directorial board incapable of achieving consensus on even the most fundamental strategic directives. The pivotal moment in the arduous siege materialized during the nascent months of 1776, when Henry Knox, a former Bostonian purveyor of literary works, who had transitioned into an accomplished artillery officer, successfully executed one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the entire conflict. Knox had embarked on an expedition to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, a stronghold previously captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in May 1775, and subsequently relocated a formidable arsenal of 59 heavy cannons and mortars across more than 300 miles of untamed wilderness amidst the profound depths of winter. This epic undertaking spanned 2 arduous months, necessitating the Herculean effort of hauling immense artillery ordnance across treacherous frozen waterways, through dense, snow-laden forests, and over formidable mountain ascents. It essentially represented the 18th century analog to the formidable task of maneuvering a grand piano up multiple flights of stairs, yet rendered immeasurably more arduous and compounded by the imperative of evading vigilant British reconnaissance patrols. Knox's invaluable artillery train reached Cambridge in January of 1776, thereby furnishing General Washington with the decisive ordnance required to render the British garrison's occupation of Boston strategically unsustainable. In March 1776, Washington orchestrated the clandestine deployment of these powerful cannons atop Dorchester Heights, commanding a dominant view of Boston Harbor, in a singular nocturnal operation that completely confounded and astonished the British command. The British garrison awoke to the unsettling realization that they were now directly imperiled by an array of heavy artillery that had been conspicuously absent merely 24 hours prior, undoubtedly an inauspicious commencement to their day. Confronted with the stark and imminent threat of their naval vessels and defensive emplacements being subjected to an unremitting bombardment by American artillery, the British concluded that the strategic value of retaining Boston had been irrevocably diminished. General Howe, therefore, entered into an unwritten understanding with his American counterpart, General Washington. The British forces would peacefully withdraw from Boston without resorting to its destruction, and in return, the Americans would permit their unhindered departure. By March the 17th, 1776, the entire British fleet had gracefully departed Boston Harbor, carrying with it approximately 1,000 Loyalist civilians who had chosen the uncertainty of expatriation over existence under burgeoning American governance. Thus concluded the protracted siege of Boston, marking the Continental Army's inaugural significant strategic triumph of the burgeoning conflict. The evacuation of Boston constituted an immense propaganda coup for the burgeoning American cause, conclusively demonstrating the vulnerability of formidable British forces and underscoring that the burgeoning rebellion transcended the confines of a localized insurrection within Massachusetts. This decisive victory additionally solidified Washington's burgeoning reputation as a capable military leader. Notwithstanding that this success was primarily attributable to his steadfast patience and astute logistical planning, rather than to dazzling tactical maneuvers on the battlefield. Indeed, it is often the case that the most profoundly impactful military successes are those characterized by a minimal engagement in direct combat. While the strategic encirclement of Boston was nearing its completion, a cascade of pivotal occurrences in other regions was actively propelling the American colonies towards an ultimate and irrevocable separation from the British Crown. In the frigid month of January 1776, the seminal work of Thomas Paine, titled Common Sense, was unveiled to the public. This persuasive pamphlet meticulously articulated the compelling arguments for American autonomy, employing a lexicon and rhetorical style that was readily accessible and profoundly resonant with the average colonist. Paine's literary approach was characterized by its unvarnished directness, fervent passion, and a conspicuous absence of the customary diplomatic niceties that had, until that juncture, typified the majority of colonial grievances and remonstrances. He boldly denigrated King George III, referring to him with the incendiary epithet, the royal brute, and posited that the quest for independence was not merely a conceivable aspiration, but an inevitable outcome, a sentiment that precisely mirrored the burgeoning convictions of a significant portion of the colonial populace. Common Sense rapidly ascended to the status of an immediate publishing phenomenon, achieving sales exceeding 100,000 copies within its inaugural 3 months, and subsequently permeating virtually every household in America where literacy was prevalent. Paine possessed an extraordinary aptitude for distilling intricate political treatises into elegantly simple yet profoundly potent prose that deeply resonated with the common citizenry. He cogently argued that the nascent American nation possessed both the requisite natural resources and the demographic strength to sustain its own sovereignty, asserting with unwavering conviction that any prospect of reconciliation with Great Britain was utterly chimerical, and that consequently, independence was the preordained destiny of America. This intellectual intervention was akin to the profound influence of a highly persuasive confidant who, through compelling logic and emotional appeal, finally convinces an individual to sever ties with a relationship that, deep down, they recognize as fundamentally deleterious. However, in this historical analogy, the someone was the formidable British Empire, and the ultimate dissolution of this relationship was punctuated by the thunderous roar of artillery. The profound ramifications of common sense are virtually immeasurable. It fundamentally transmuted the very parameters of the public discourse, shifting the central contention from a binary choice between reconciliation and resistance to a stark dichotomy between complete independence and perpetual subjugation. Prior to the widespread dissemination of Paine's incendiary pamphlet, the majority of colonists largely perceived themselves as loyal British subjects, merely seeking an equitable redress of their legitimate grievances. Yet, in the wake of internalizing the arguments presented in Common Sense, a considerable number began to reconceptualize their identity, viewing themselves as distinct Americans ardently pursuing liberation from the yoke of foreign despotism. This period represents one of those rare and extraordinary junctures in human history where a solitary piece of written exposition demonstrably altered the trajectory of historical events, thereby unequivocally affirming the enduring adage that, on occasion, the pen wields a power far greater than the sword. Although it must be acknowledged that the deployment of physical armaments often remains an indispensable complement to the force of articulated ideas. The esteemed Continental Congress, convened in the vibrant city of Philadelphia during the spring of 1776, found itself subjected to an escalating and inexorable demand to formally proclaim independence. The prevailing military landscape rendered any prospect of a peaceful reconciliation increasingly improbable, if not entirely impossible. British military forces were actively orchestrating a colossal invasion. Foreign mercenaries were being conscripted to engage in hostilities against the colonial insurgents, and the monarch, King George III, had unequivocally declared the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. More critically, the pragmatic exigencies inherent in prosecuting a full-scale war necessitated that the colonies commence operating as a de facto independent nation, engaging in diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers to secure vital assistance and painstakingly establishing formal governmental frameworks. The intricate process of formally declaring independence encompassed far more complexity than a mere pronouncement that America had unilaterally disengaged from the dominion of the British Empire. The Continental Congress was compelled to meticulously deliberate upon the multifaceted legal, diplomatic, and military ramifications inherent in such a momentous and epoch-defining decision. The act of declaring independence would, in the eyes of British jurisprudence, instantly brand the colonists as traitors, a capital offense punishable by death should their revolutionary endeavor ultimately fail. Furthermore, it would necessitate the arduous task of establishing entirely novel forms of governance and embarking upon a concerted quest for international recognition and crucial external support. This monumental undertaking was analogous to an individual simultaneously deciding to relinquish their current employment, relocate to an entirely new urban environment, and embark upon an entirely different professional trajectory. With the added perilous caveat of facing execution should these audacious plans not materialize as intended. The burgeoning impetus towards independence gathered considerable momentum throughout the spring of 1776, as individual colonial assemblies began to issue explicit directives to their respective delegates, urging them to endorse a formal declaration of independence. Virginia, a prominent and influential colony, assumed a leading role in May 1776 when its convention formally instructed its representatives to propose the concept of independence to the Continental Congress. Subsequently, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a pivotal resolution on June 7, 1776, boldly asserting that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. This seminal resolution functioned as a formal, legally articulated proposal to sever ties with Great Britain, meticulously crafted with all the requisite legal precision and formalistic language. While the Continental Congress engaged in vigorous debate over Lee's momentous resolution, it simultaneously appointed a distinguished committee tasked with the critical responsibility of drafting a Declaration of Independence. This esteemed committee comprised an intellectual constellation: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Essentially, this formidable assembly represented an all-star cadre of colonial intellectuals, though it is highly probable they did not perceive themselves in such grandiose terms at that precise historical juncture. Jefferson was ultimately selected to undertake the prodigious task of composing the initial draft, a decision influenced in part by his renowned literary acumen, and, somewhat prosaically, because both Adams and Franklin were already heavily engrossed in other demanding committee responsibilities. It is a curious historical footnote that, on occasion, some of history's most profoundly significant documents are penned by the individual who happens to possess the most available leisure time. Jefferson's preliminary draft of the Declaration of Independence emerged as an unparalleled tour de force of political philosophy and incisive propaganda, seamlessly interweaving the progressive Enlightenment concepts of inherent natural rights with a meticulously enumerated litany of specific grievances directed against the oppressive policies of British rule. The enduringly celebrated inaugural phrases, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," meticulously articulated foundational principles that would subsequently exert a profound and transformative influence upon democratic movements across the globe for centuries to come. This monumental achievement was akin to the audacious act of formulating the definitive mission statement for the very essence of human freedom, an accomplishment that, by any conceivable metric, constitutes an exceptionally productive day's endeavor. The Declaration proceeded to meticulously enumerate 27 distinct and specific grievances leveled against the reign of King George III, ranging from the egregious act of imposing taxes on us without our consent to the detrimental policy of cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This comprehensive catalog of complaints reads like an exhaustive inventory of every perceived affront and vexation that the colonists experienced under British dominion. It encompassed matters of profound gravity, such as denying trial by jury, alongside issues that, while irritating, might appear comparatively trivial, like sending swarms of officers to harass the people. Jefferson, in essence, was crafting the most historically consequential breakup letter ever conceived, meticulously articulating, with painstaking detail, precisely why the existing relationship was untenable and why the time had unequivocally arrived for a mutual parting of ways. The Continental Congress engaged in an intense and protracted debate over Jefferson's initial draft for several days, during which numerous alterations and revisions were introduced. While Jefferson himself found these editorial changes profoundly agonizing, they were, in all likelihood, indispensable for securing the necessary political consensus. The most significant excision was a comprehensive passage that vehemently condemned the institution of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This controversial section was ultimately removed to prevent the alienation of the southern colonies, whose economies were deeply intertwined with slavery, as well as certain northern merchants who derived substantial profits from the slave trade. The profound irony inherent in proclaiming the self-evident truth that all men are created equal while simultaneously perpetuating the abhorrent practice of slavery was not lost on contemporary observers, and this glaring contradiction would cast a long, dark shadow over American politics for the ensuing century. It serves as a stark reminder that even revolutionary documents, in their genesis, are sometimes compelled to make uncomfortable compromises with the immutable realities of political expediency. On the auspicious date of July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress formally endorsed Lee's pivotal resolution advocating for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, 1776, they officially approved the meticulously finalized version of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, a prominent figure, had presciently anticipated that July 2nd would be commemorated as America's official Independence Day. However, the capricious currents of history ultimately determined that July 4th would be the more enduringly memorable date, most likely because it marked the formal approval of the definitive document itself, rather than merely the foundational concept. The ceremonial signing of the Declaration was a moment imbued with profound drama, as the assembled delegates literally pledged their very lives and fortunes to this audacious cause. As Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, with a blend of gravitas and gallows humor, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The Declaration of Independence transcended the confines of a mere political communiqué. It emerged as a profound articulation of universal principles that would profoundly influence and inspire democratic movements across the globe. The revolutionary concept that governments derive their legitimate authority from the explicit consent of the governed, and that the citizenry possesses an inherent right to alter or even abolish governmental structures that become destructive of the fundamental purposes for which they were established, was truly groundbreaking in an era dominated by the entrenched dogma of absolute monarchy. This bold assertion was akin to unequivocally proclaiming that the long-held doctrine of the divine right of kings was, in reality, nothing more than a remarkably persistent and pervasive myth, a revelation that was undeniably destined to provoke considerable discomfort and consternation among the established powers. The immediate and transformative impact of the Declaration was to fundamentally reconfigure the nature of the colonial rebellion, elevating it into a full-fledged war for national independence, with all the profound implications that such a metamorphosis entailed. The colonists were no longer merely British subjects seeking a redress of grievances. They were now self-declared Americans, vigorously engaged in a struggle for their inherent freedom against a foreign sovereign power. This pivotal shift in perspective proved absolutely crucial for sustaining morale during the arduous and exceptionally challenging years that lay ahead, primarily because it is demonstrably easier to endure profound hardship and sacrifice when one is fighting for the lofty ideal of national independence, than when one is merely protesting against perceived injustices in taxation. The Declaration also harbored significant diplomatic repercussions, as it effectively legitimized the prospect of foreign powers extending support to the American cause, without technically infringing upon Great Britain's internal affairs. France, a nation that had been assiduously seeking an opportune moment to strategically weaken its perennial rival, Britain, ever since its resounding defeat in the 7 Years' War, evinced a particularly keen interest in championing American independence. The Declaration, in essence, erected a conspicuous placard proclaiming "Help Wanted, Enemies of Britain," a pragmatic international relations strategy that was precisely tailored to the exigencies of the unfolding geopolitical situation. While the Continental Congress was engrossed in the momentous task of declaring independence in Philadelphia, the prevailing military situation was simultaneously becoming increasingly formidable and precarious. Although the British forces had evacuated Boston, they were meticulously preparing a colossal invasion force, unequivocally intent on decisively crushing the burgeoning rebellion once and for all. General Howe had strategically relocated his substantial army to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he was subsequently bolstered by significant reinforcements dispatched from Britain and a formidable fleet of warships, which collectively conferred upon the British an overwhelming superiority at sea. The meticulously conceived British strategic objective was to seize control of New York City, a critical maneuver that would grant them dominion over the vital Hudson River and effectively sever New England from the remaining colonial territories. General Washington, acutely aware that New York would inevitably become the next pivotal target, prudently relocated the Continental Army from Boston to New York in the spring of 1776, bracing for the impending confrontation. New York in the spring of 1776 marked a critical juncture in the nascent American Revolution, a period pregnant with anticipation and the looming threat of significant conflict. The very air seemed to hum with the prelude to an epic confrontation, as both sides braced for the inevitable clash for control of this strategically vital port city. The monumental task of defending New York presented an almost insurmountable challenge. The city's geographic layout, being largely insular and surrounded by expansive waterways, rendered it exceedingly susceptible to multi-directional assaults, particularly from an adversary possessing an overwhelming naval advantage. General George Washington's nascent army, a motley collection primarily composed of short-term militia units, suffered from woefully inadequate training and a severe scarcity of essential equipment. In stark contrast, the approaching British forces comprised highly disciplined professional soldiers, formidable German mercenaries, and were supported by the mightiest naval fleet known to the world. The situation was akin to attempting to fortify a delicate sandcastle against the relentless surge of a colossal tsunami, albeit one equipped with a devastating array of artillery. The formidable British invasion force that ultimately descended upon New York Harbor in the summer of 1776 represented the most extensive military expedition Great Britain had ever dispatched across the seas. General William Howe commanded an imposing contingent of approximately 32,000 troops. A formidable assembly that included 8,000 Hessian mercenaries, all operating under the protective umbrella of a vast fleet exceeding 400 ships, expertly commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. The sheer spectacle of this colossal armada, dominating the entire expanse of New York Harbor, must have evoked a complex cocktail of awe and profound terror among the American populace, not unlike witnessing a celestial superweapon materialize within one's own solar system. General Washington's Continental Army, conversely, existed as a far less imposing entity. While official rolls listed around 19,000 men, the actual number of effectively deployable troops was considerably diminished due to pervasive illness, rampant desertion, and the chronic logistical quagmires inherent to 18th-century military operations. A significant portion of these American soldiers consisted of green militia, entirely unseasoned in facing professional European armies in direct combat, and their weaponry ranged from barely serviceable to utterly non-existent. The glaring asymmetry in military power was so patently obvious that a number of American officers cautiously proposed abandoning New York without a fight, a course of action that, while arguably sound from a military perspective, was deemed politically unfeasible. The Battle of Long Island, which raged on August 27, 1776, served as General Washington's inaugural true test as a military leader, a harrowing engagement that nearly extinguished the flickering flame of the American Revolution before it had truly ignited. General Howe's meticulously crafted strategy involved disembarking troops on Long Island and executing a multi-pronged assault on the American positions, leveraging his numerical superiority and the seasoned prowess of his professional soldiers to utterly crush Washington's army in a single decisive confrontation. The operational blueprint was undeniably astute, its execution commendably proficient, and the eventual outcome proved to be an unmitigated catastrophe for the American forces. Washington had judiciously positioned his troops on the elevated terrain of Brooklyn Heights, commanding a strategic overview of New York Harbor. However, a critical oversight in failing to adequately secure the Jamaica Pass proved disastrous, allowing British forces to execute a swift and decisive flanking maneuver around the American lines. The engagement swiftly devolved into a chaotic rout, with American forces scattering in disarray and fleeing in panic as British and Hessian contingents pressed their relentless advance from multiple directions. The Continental Army suffered devastating losses, with approximately 1,400 men killed, wounded, or captured, a stark contrast to the mere 400 casualties sustained by the British. This was precisely the kind of lopsided defeat that typically spells the end for rebellions, and it might well have concluded this one, had it not been for the extraordinary events that transpired next. General Washington found himself in an agonizing predicament, trapped on Brooklyn Heights with the beleaguered remnants of his army, staring down the grim prospect of complete annihilation once the British completed their encirclement. The gravity of the situation was so profound that surrender appeared to be the only rational recourse, a decision that would have irrevocably sealed the fate of American independence and almost certainly led to the execution of the Continental Congress members as traitors. Instead, Washington made one of the most audacious and pivotal decisions of the entire conflict. He resolved to orchestrate a daring nocturnal evacuation of his entire army across the East River to the relative safety of Manhattan under the shroud of darkness. The evacuation of Brooklyn stands as one of those military operations that defies logic, achieving success despite being almost impossibly difficult. Washington faced the monumental challenge of transporting approximately 9,000 men, along with their essential equipment and supplies, across a mile of water in a flotilla of small boats, all while meticulously avoiding detection by the formidable British fleet. The entire operation demanded impeccable timing, absolute silence, and a considerable measure of meteorological good fortune. Providentially for the Americans, a dense fog miraculously rolled in precisely as dawn was breaking, providing a crucial veil that concealed the final, critical stages of the evacuation from British observers, who were likely left to wonder where their elusive adversaries had vanished. While the triumphant withdrawal from Brooklyn undeniably preserved the Continental Army from utter destruction, it conspicuously failed to resolve General Washington's overarching strategic predicaments. The British maintained undisputed dominion over New York Harbor. Their military supremacy remained crushing, and Washington's forces largely comprised raw, inexperienced troops, many of whom had just endured a devastating defeat in their inaugural significant engagement. The successful evacuation, therefore, was akin to narrowly escaping a burning building. It was undoubtedly preferable to the alternative, but the survivors were still left without a home or a secure base. General Washington's protracted retreat from New York persisted throughout the autumn of 1776, as British forces relentlessly harried the Continental Army across the length of Manhattan, through the expanse of the Bronx, and deep into the territories of New Jersey. The American army was compelled to remain in constant motion, engaging in sporadic minor skirmishes, but assiduously evading any large-scale confrontations that could potentially precipitate another catastrophe akin to the Battle of Long Island. This continuous movement was a calculated strategic withdrawal, though for the weary and demoralized soldiers undertaking it, the experience likely felt more akin to an ignominious flight. The arduous retreat across New Jersey represented one of the absolute niders in the unfolding narrative of the American Revolution. Washington's army dwindled alarmingly day by day, a consequence of widespread desertions, the expiration of service terms, and the outright disintegration of entire units. By December 1776, the operational strength of the Continental Army had plummeted to fewer than 3,000 active personnel, who were themselves inadequately provisioned, profoundly dispirited, and yearning desperately for their homes. The British, meanwhile, had comfortably established their winter encampments throughout New Jersey, seemingly confident that the insurrection had been effectively quashed and the war all but concluded. The profound crisis of late 1776 served as the impetus for Thomas Paine to compose The Crisis, another profoundly influential pamphlet that played a crucial role in bolstering American morale during the war's most somber phase. Paine's renowned inaugural pronouncements. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Masterfully encapsulated the dire straits while simultaneously issuing a powerful call to Americans to exhibit unwavering resolve. It was, in essence, a fervent pep talk delivered to an entire beleaguered nation, arriving precisely at the moment when such encouragement was most desperately needed. General Washington acutely recognized the imperative for a decisive triumph to rejuvenate plummeting morale and avert the total disintegration of the American endeavor. The formidable constraint, however, was his army's debilitating weakness, which precluded any assault on a substantial British fortification. Furthermore, time was rapidly running out, with numerous enlistment contracts set to expire at the close of December. Washington's ingenious resolution was to target a more diminutive, isolated military outpost that might be susceptible to a sudden, unexpected assault, specifically the Hessian contingent garrisoned in Trenton, New Jersey. The strategic blueprint for assaulting Trenton was remarkably daring, bordering on sheer recklessness. Washington would be compelled to navigate the treacherous, ice-choked Delaware River amidst the harshness of winter, conduct a grueling 9-mile nocturnal march through a raging snowstorm, and launch an offensive against a fortified position defended by highly trained professional soldiers. This entire audacious endeavor was to be undertaken with an army teetering on the very brink of collapse. The operation, by its very nature, demanded flawless execution, a precarious gamble rarely advisable for the fate of an entire revolution. Yet desperate times inherently call for desperate measures, and General Washington's predicament was as dire as any commander could possibly face. The iconic crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night 1776 has now become one of the most celebrated vignettes in American annals, forever enshrined by Emanuel Lewitz's evocative painting, which depicts General Washington's valorous stance amidst a boat filled with resolute soldiers. The probable reality, however, was far less heroic and considerably more arduous. A scene characterized by struggling soldiers grappling with frost-laden oars, horses losing their footing on treacherous, icy riverbanks, and a pervasive, gnawing uncertainty among all participants about the actual viability of this audacious scheme. Sukuno, the crossing itself, consumed far more time than anticipated, resulting in Washington's contingent arriving on the New Jersey shore hours behind schedule, thus confronting the perilous prospect of launching their assault in broad daylight, rather than under the desired cloak of night. The audacious attack on Trenton on December 26, 1776, succeeded beyond even General Washington's most optimistic forecasts. The Hessian garrison, under the command of Colonel Johann Rall, was caught entirely by surprise. They had been engaged in Christmas festivities and evidently harbored no expectation that any force would be audacious enough to mount an offensive amidst a blizzard. The engagement itself concluded in under an hour, culminating in the capture of nearly 1,000 enemy combatants by the Americans, who, remarkably, sustained only a minimal number of casualties. It was, without question, precisely the sort of spectacular and desperately needed victory that the struggling American cause so urgently required. The profound ramifications of the Trenton victory extended well beyond its immediate tactical significance. It unequivocally proved the Continental Army's capacity to engage and triumph, a revelation indispensable for sustaining troop morale and averting widespread abandonment. Furthermore, it shattered the perception of British and Allied invincibility, thereby galvanizing greater enlistment among American patriots and renewing confidence in the cause. Most critically, it bestowed upon General Washington the essential credibility required to persuade his weary soldiers to prolong their service terms and persist in the arduous struggle. This demonstrated a fundamental truth. Occasionally, a modest triumph delivered at an opportune juncture can eclipse the strategic value of a grander victory achieved under less favorable circumstances. General Washington swiftly followed up the Trenton success with another victorious engagement against British elements at Princeton on January 3, 1777, further substantially elevating American morale and facilitating the establishment of secure winter encampments in Morristown, New Jersey. The Princeton campaign served as compelling evidence of Washington's remarkable evolution as a military leader, demonstrating his capacity to assimilate crucial lessons from previous setbacks and hone his command efficacy. He was actively developing a new tactical philosophy, a calculated approach centered on eschewing direct, large-scale confrontations while opportunistically targeting vulnerable, isolated enemy detachments, a methodology perfectly tailored to capitalize on his army's inherent strengths while mitigating its pronounced deficiencies. The period spanning the winter of 1776 into 1777 represented a pivotal juncture in the ongoing conflict, not due to any profound alteration in the underlying military dynamics, but rather because both opposing factions came to a stark realization that this was destined to become a protracted and arduous struggle, far removed from a swift conclusion. The formidable martial prowess of the British had been evinced, yet they had not managed to definitively quash the insurrection. Conversely, the American forces had proven their resilience in the face of significant military setbacks, persisting in their resistance, though they still confronted formidable obstacles concerning their logistical provisions, troop instruction, and global diplomatic acceptance. The intricate scheme crafted by the British for 1777 was conceived with the primary objective of concluding hostilities by severing New England's connection from the other nascent colonies. This plan, meticulously developed by General John Burgoyne, envisioned a tripartite offensive converging upon Albany, New York, thereby securing British dominion over the vital Hudson River Valley. General Burgoyne himself would lead an expedition southward from Canada, commanding approximately 8,000 soldiers. Concurrently, General Howe was slated to progress northward from New York City, while a comparatively smaller contingent, commanded by Colonel Barry St. Leger, was designated to advance eastward from Lake Ontario. Such an audacious undertaking, while appearing strategically sound in theoretical terms, necessitated impeccably synchronized movements among detachments dispersed across vast distances, hampered by rudimentary communication capabilities. A fundamental flaw inherent in Burgoyne's grand design lay in its presumption of General Howe's unwavering cooperation. However, General Howe harbored distinct strategic notions regarding the path to victory. Rather than advancing northward to bolster Burgoyne's forces, Howe opted to launch an assault on Philadelphia. He seemingly harbored the conviction that the seizure of the nascent American capital would effectively extinguish the insurrection. Consequently, this unilateral decision compelled Burgoyne to proceed into New York, bereft of the crucial reinforcements he had anticipated. A strategic divergence akin to meticulously orchestrating a celebratory surprise event, only to discover that a significant portion of the invited attendees chose to divert their presence to an entirely separate gathering. Initially, General Burgoyne's invasion commenced with considerable promise. His forces successfully seized Fort Ticonderoga in July 1777, a position previously regarded as an indispensable American bastion. The precipitous fall of Ticonderoga engendered widespread alarm across New England and drew sharp censure upon the American officers who had relinquished the fortification without offering substantial resistance. Nevertheless, the initial triumph was swiftly overshadowed by the onset of Burgoyne's myriad difficulties, as his sizable army soon found itself mired in the unforgiving wilderness stretching between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. The American command devised a cunning strategy to counter Burgoyne's incursion, a plan initially conceived by General Philip Schuyler and subsequently executed by General Horatio Gates, who had assumed leadership of the Northern Department, relieving Schuyler of his command. This tactical approach focused on eschewing large-scale engagements, instead concentrating on persistent harassment of Burgoyne's vital supply convoys and deliberately impeding his progress through the arduous wilderness terrain. Colonial troops systematically obstructed pathways by felling massive trees, demolished crucial bridges, and undertook various measures to render Burgoyne's arduous march as challenging as conceivably possible. The cumulative effect resembled the execution of the most intricate and extensive practical joke imaginable, albeit one fraught with profound and consequential military ramifications. General Burgoyne's formidable military contingent, comprising not merely trained soldiers, but also hundreds of non-combatant camp followers, numerous heavy artillery pieces, and an extensive train of baggage wagons, proved remarkably ill-equipped for the rigors of wilderness combat. Consequently, the entire force advanced at an agonizingly slow crawl through the thick, unforgiving forests of upstate New York, occasionally managing a paltry average of merely a mile per day. Adding to these impediments, Burgoyne himself had made the rather dubious choice to transport an extravagant volume of personal belongings, encompassing crates of exquisite wines and the presence of his mistress, factors that undoubtedly did little to enhance the army's operational agility. The entire endeavor was akin to attempting the translocation of a modest urban settlement through an impenetrable woodland, an undertaking precisely as unfeasible in practice as it sounds in theory. The initial substantial reversal for General Burgoyne's campaign manifested at the Battle of Bennington, fought on August 16, 1777. There, a segment of his forces, dispatched with the objective of seizing American provisions, was instead decisively repulsed by the New Hampshire militia, skillfully commanded by General John Stark. General Stark is famously reported to have exhorted his troops prior to the engagement with the stirring declaration, "We'll beat the enemy or Molly." Stark sleeps a widow tonight. A pronouncement that could be interpreted as either profoundly resolute or strikingly fatalistic, contingent upon one's viewpoint. The American combatants not only routed the combined Hessian and British contingents, but also secured invaluable provisions and military apparatus, whereas Burgoyne suffered the irreplaceable loss of approximately 900 soldiers. Concurrently, the western component of the elaborate British strategic offensive also encountered significant impediments. Colonel St. Leger's eastward progression from Lake Ontario was effectively checked at Fort Stanwix by tenacious American forces operating under the leadership of Colonel Peter Gansevoort. Gansevoort's resolute defense served to illustrate that not every American commander was inclined to abandon their defensive postures at the initial indication of adversity. The protracted encirclement of Fort Stanwix evolved into an exceedingly intricate military engagement, drawing in not only British regular troops and American Continental soldiers, but also Loyalist militia units and a diverse array of Native American tribes. A confluence of forces that transformed the Mohawk Valley into a bewildering mosaic of clashing loyalties and multifaceted military maneuvers. The successful relief of Fort Stanwix was primarily engineered by Benedict Arnold. At this particular juncture in the conflict, Arnold remained widely recognized as one of America's most exceptionally capable military leaders, having not yet contemplated that disloyalty might present a feasible career trajectory. Arnold masterfully employed a dual approach, combining direct military pressure with astute psychological operations to compel St. Leger to relinquish the siege, notably disseminating fabricated reports of an imminent and formidable American army. Leger's subsequent withdrawal effectively dismantled the western component of Burgoyne's overarching strategy and liberated American forces, enabling their focused deployment against the principal British thrust. As September 1777 unfolded, General Burgoyne discovered his predicament spiraling into an increasingly perilous state. His expeditionary force was facing critical shortages of provisions. His vital lines of communication with Canada were subjected to relentless assaults, and American contingents were amassing in ever greater strength to obstruct his progress. Although Burgoyne had managed to reach the Hudson River in the vicinity of Saratoga, the anticipated straightforward advance to Albany was supplanted by the daunting reality of confronting a formidable, well-fortified American army commanded by General Gates, which in fact outnumbered his own beleaguered contingent. The engagements collectively known as the Battles of Saratoga, contested on September 19th and October 7th, 1777, ultimately constituted the definitive watershed moment of the American Revolution, even if the immediate experience on the battlefield did not necessarily convey such historical import to the combatants themselves. The initial confrontation, designated the Battle of Freeman's Farm, largely concluded in a tactical stalemate, both belligerents enduring substantial casualties without either securing a definitive strategic edge. This particular engagement was distinguished by the exceptional efficacy of American riflemen, who demonstrated devastating precision against British officers, and by the audacious, ubiquitous tactical maneuvers of Benedict Arnold, who appeared to be simultaneously present across multiple fronts throughout the fierce combat. The subsequent clash, famously termed the Battle of Bemis Heights, represented an unequivocal American triumph, one that decisively predetermined Burgoyne's ultimate downfall. Notably, Arnold, despite having been controversially stripped of his command by General Gates subsequent to a disagreement concerning battle strategies, nonetheless participated in this pivotal engagement without official sanction, suffering a wound while audaciously leading a charge against entrenched British emplacements. Such unsanctioned acts of valor were characteristic of Arnold's distinctive military persona, profoundly effective yet inherently insubordinate, a duality that likely foreshadowed his eventual decision to defect. In the aftermath of his decisive defeat at Bemis Heights, General Burgoyne's forces discovered themselves completely encircled by American contingents, with all prospects of reinforcement or withdrawal unequivocally foreclosed. His beleaguered army was rapidly depleting its stores of provisions and ordnance. Instances of desertion were escalating markedly, and the American ranks were swelling daily with the continuous arrival of militia units from across the New England region. Consequently, on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne formally capitulated, surrendering his entire command of nearly 6,000 soldiers to General Gates in an event subsequently immortalized as the Convention of Saratoga. The capitulation at Saratoga represented the most momentous American triumph of the conflict until that specific juncture. This pivotal success not only neutralized an entire British expeditionary army, but also conclusively evinced the capacity of American forces to overcome seasoned European professional soldiers in conventional military engagements. The profound psychological repercussions of this victory were immense, significantly elevating American morale while simultaneously delivering a staggering blow to British public sentiment. Crucially, it served to persuade the French monarchy that the American colonists possessed a credible prospect of securing their sovereignty, thereby paving the way for the critically important foreign alliance that would, in due course, prove to be the ultimate determinant of the war's outcome. The momentous French determination to intervene in the hostilities was predicated upon a confluence of astute strategic considerations and deep-seated historical antagonism towards Great Britain. Since its defeat in the 7 Years' War, France had persistently sought an opportune moment to undermine British global dominance, a goal that American independence promised to fulfill, concurrently unlocking fresh avenues for lucrative commercial exchange. The resounding triumph at Saratoga furnished French diplomatic and military authorities with the conclusive proof they required, affirming that extending support to America represented a judicious and promising investment, rather than a futile expenditure on an already doomed endeavor. The formal Franco-American alliance, formally ratified in February 1778, irrevocably escalated the American Revolution from a localized colonial insurgency into a sprawling global confrontation. France's commitment encompassed not merely crucial military and naval assistance, but also vital diplomatic acknowledgement, a development that emboldened other European nations to lend their backing to the American struggle. Ultimately, both Spain and the Netherlands would also enter the fray against Great Britain, compelling the British Empire to disperse its defensive efforts globally, rather than focusing its full might on quelling the American rebellion. France's intervention fundamentally reshaped British strategic imperatives, obliging London to divert considerable resources to safeguard crucial territories such as the Caribbean, Gibraltar, and India, alongside its ongoing struggle in North America. Consequently, the British found themselves unable to dedicate their complete military apparatus to the subjugation of the American colonies, a strategic dispersal that afforded the Americans invaluable respite to reconstitute their armed forces and vigorously prosecute the war. Concurrently with these pivotal diplomatic breakthroughs unfolding on the international stage, General George Washington and the beleaguered Continental Army found themselves grappling with an exceedingly arduous chapter of the Revolutionary War at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, throughout the unforgiving winter of 1777 to 1778. The military force had retreated to this desolate location subsequent to their fruitless endeavors to thwart the British occupation of Philadelphia, and these frigid cantonments swiftly materialized into an emblem of American unyielding determination amidst seemingly insurmountable adversities. The prevailing conditions within Valley Forge were demonstrably execrable, defying even the rudimentary norms of 18th-century military encampments. The beleaguered soldiers suffered from a profound deficit of sustenance, proper attire, and protective lodgings, with numerous individuals trudging unshod through the relentless snow, their painful progress marked by crimson imprints as they fulfilled their arduous duties. Epidemic illnesses proliferated unchecked. Vital provisions were practically depleted, and the collective spirit had plummeted to its nadir. General Washington, in a desperate communication to the Continental Congress, conveyed his grave concerns, asserting that without immediate amelioration of their plight, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse, a stark prognosis of utter collapse. The profound tribulations endured at Valley Forge were profoundly compounded by the disconcerting awareness that provisions and vital materiel were indeed available within the region, yet were inexplicably failing to arrive at the encampment. This logistical paralysis was a direct consequence of systemic deficiencies within the Continental Congress's nascent financial framework and the severe disruption of established supply networks. Agricultural producers, for their part, frequently evinced an understandable unwillingness to exchange their harvests for continental currency, a medium of exchange swiftly depreciating into utter valuelessness. They consistently opted instead to conduct commerce with the British forces, who, possessing greater stability, invariably proffered payment in tangible gold and silver coinage. Thus, in a cruel paradox, the Continental Army found itself literally perishing from hunger amidst an abundance of resources. Notwithstanding these immense privations, Valley Forge remarkably evolved into a pivotal juncture in the maturation of the Continental Army as a formidable combat entity. The beleaguered army was significantly augmented by the timely arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, an experienced Prussian officer who magnanimously offered his expertise to instruct the American troops in sophisticated European military methodologies and rigorous disciplinary protocols. Steuben's meticulously structured training program fundamentally reshaped the Continental Army, elevating it from a disparate collection of loosely organized militia units into a coherent, professional military organization, imparting comprehensive instruction encompassing fundamental drill procedures and progressing to intricate battlefield maneuvers. Crucially, Steuben's innovative training methods were ingeniously tailored to suit the unique American conditions and prevailing cultural attitudes. Perceiving that the independent-minded American soldiers necessitated a distinct approach compared to their European conscript counterparts, he consciously prioritized the cultivation of practical combat skills above mere ceremonial parade ground drills. He meticulously elucidated the rationale underpinning military procedures instead of merely exacting unquestioning obedience, and consistently accorded the soldiers a greater degree of respect than was conventionally observed in European armies of the era. Furthermore, Steuben faced the formidable challenge of surmounting a significant linguistic impediment, as his command of English was rudimentary, necessitating communication primarily through the diligent efforts of interpreters. Beyond the rigorous training, the winter encampment at Valley Forge also precipitated significant transformations within the Continental Army's hierarchical command and structural organization. General Washington judiciously utilized this period to overhaul his command structure, promoting officers who had demonstrated genuine competence and valor, and systematically purging certain political appointees whose battlefield performance had proven unequivocally inept. The military contingent that eventually departed Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, though numerically diminished compared to its initial strength, was nevertheless undeniably superior in its training, significantly improved in its organization, and far more cohesive than any American fighting force previously assembled. The profound metamorphosis of the Continental Army, forged in the crucible of Valley Forge, was put to the test almost instantaneously when the British High Command opted to relinquish Philadelphia and redeploy their troops, consolidating their strength in New York. This strategic withdrawal was directly precipitated by France's formal entry into the conflict, a development that rendered the British garrison's situation in Philadelphia precariously exposed to potential assaults by formidable French naval assets. The British relinquishment of the city consequently presented General Washington with a coveted opportunity to engage the retreating British column as it traversed New Jersey, culminating in the significant engagement known as the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778. The Battle of Monmouth was distinguished by a confluence of remarkable circumstances. Notably, it was contested under oppressively scorching conditions, resulting in a higher incidence of casualties attributable to heat stroke than to direct enemy combat. The engagement also showcased one of the most intensely charged confrontations between senior American officers throughout the entire conflict, occurring when General Washington publicly and vehemently rebuked General Charles Lee for issuing an unauthorized order to retreat. The fury displayed by Washington was reportedly so incandescent that eyewitnesses later attested to having never before, nor subsequently, encountered such forceful language emanating from the usually composed commander. The military engagement itself concluded in what was largely considered a tactical stalemate, with both belligerents subsequently asserting triumph, yet neither having secured a truly decisive advantage. Nevertheless, the commendable performance of the Continental Army at Monmouth unequivocally demonstrated the efficacy of Baron von Steuben's rigorous training regimen. American troops courageously held their ground against seasoned British regulars in open battle, and executed intricate maneuvers amidst active enemy fire, a testament to their newfound discipline. The British forces proceeded with their planned withdrawal to New York, while General Washington's army strategically established new positions within the formidable Hudson Highlands, thereby initiating a strategic stalemate that would largely define the character of the conflict in the Northern Theater for the ensuing several years. France's formal commitment to the war also heralded the deployment of its inaugural significant military expedition to the North American continent. Upon Admiral d'Estaing's arrival off the American coastline with a formidable fleet of warships in July 1778, the sudden manifestation of French naval might portended a formidable challenge to Britain's long-held maritime supremacy, a strategic advantage that had consistently underpinned British military operations throughout the conflict. However, the initial joint Franco-American undertaking, an ambitious endeavor to seize the British garrison entrenched at Newport, Rhode Island, proved to be an unequivocal debacle, attributable to both inadequate synchronization between the Allied forces and d'Estaing's unilateral decision to abort the mission upon the unexpected appearance of a British naval squadron. The ignominious failure at Newport starkly illuminated a persistent and fundamental challenge inherent within the nascent Franco-American alliance. The two Allied nations possessed inherently divergent strategic imperatives and distinct military cultures, factors that frequently rendered seamless cooperation arduous. The French monarchy's principal motivation, for instance, lay in debilitating Great Britain and safeguarding its extensive colonial holdings, whereas the Americans were singularly preoccupied with securing their hard-won independence from British rule. Such disparate objectives inevitably generated intermittent tensions throughout the duration of the alliance, yet these never escalated to a degree sufficient to precipitate its dissolution. Following 1778, the conflict in the Northern Theater devolved into a protracted pattern of strategic deadlock, characterized by both belligerents occupying entrenched positions of strength, yet neither capable of attaining a truly decisive military ascendancy. The British forces retained firm control over New York City and its vital harbor, thereby securing a robust operational base, while the Americans exerted dominion over the majority of the adjacent rural territories, enabling them to pose a persistent threat to British supply arteries. General Washington's overarching strategy throughout this phase was primarily characterized by a deliberate avoidance of large-scale engagements, prioritizing the preservation of the Continental Army as a continuous, viable threat to British military endeavors. This cautious approach, while strategically prudent, often proved a source of considerable frustration for many officers and political figures who yearned for more aggressive offensive maneuvers. Yet it likely represented the sole pragmatic course of action, considering the comparative strengths of the opposing forces. Washington sagaciously comprehended that so long as the Continental Army remained an active entity, the British could not legitimately assert ultimate victory in the war, irrespective of their control over prominent urban centers or success in isolated skirmishes. The principal theater of military operations progressively gravitated towards the southern colonies, commencing in 1778, as the British government concluded that the southern region presented more auspicious opportunities for achieving decisive victory than its northern counterpart. This so-called Southern strategy was predicated upon the fundamental assumption of a greater proliferation of Loyalist sympathizers within the South, individuals presumed eager to lend their support to British forces. It also posited that the agrarian, plantation-based economy of the South would prove considerably more susceptible to disruption and exploitation than the more robustly diversified northern economy, thereby offering a clearer path to subdue the rebellion. The British Southern Campaign was inaugurated with the swift subjugation of Savannah, Georgia, in December 1778, an objective achieved with notable facility by a comparatively modest British contingent, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. The unequivocal success at Savannah significantly bolstered the conviction among British officials that their meticulously conceived Southern strategy was fundamentally sound and viable, prompting them to commence planning increasingly ambitious military operations designed to systematically dismantle American resistance across the entire Southern theater. The American counter-response to the burgeoning British Southern offensive was regrettably impeded by the very same systemic deficiencies that had chronically afflicted the Continental Army throughout the protracted conflict. These persistent issues included chronic shortages of vital provisions, insufficient military training, and persistent political meddling in critical military operations, all of which undermined effective resistance. Moreover, the Southern theater itself presented a distinctive array of operational difficulties, encompassing a more widely scattered populace, challenging topographical features, and a convoluted amalgamation of regular forces, local militia, and irregular combatants operating on both American and British sides, further complicating strategic planning and execution. The protracted siege of Charleston, South Carolina, initiated in March 1780, culminated in what proved to be the most substantial British triumph of the entire war. During this pivotal engagement, General Benjamin Lincoln was compelled to capitulate, surrendering both the strategic city and his entire command, an estimated 5,000 men, to the forces of General Henry Clinton in May 1780. The capitulation of Charleston represented an utterly devastating setback for the American cause in the Southern colonies, effectively neutralizing the largest American army deployed in the region and granting the British unassailable control over South Carolina's most economically and strategically vital port. The resounding British success at Charleston was swiftly succeeded by a series of additional military triumphs that ostensibly validated the strategic sagacity of the Southern campaign. Lord Cornwallis, having assumed overall command of British forces in the South, following General Clinton's return to New York, inflicted a crushing defeat upon yet another American army at Camden, South Carolina, in August 1780, an engagement that effectively eradicated any semblance of organized American resistance within the state. The decisive victory at Camden was particularly conspicuous for the lamentable performance of the American militia, who precipitously abandoned the battlefield almost immediately upon the commencement of hostilities, thereby leaving the outnumbered Continental troops to be inexorably overwhelmed by the numerically and tactically superior British forces. However, the initial British ascendancy in conventional battles was profoundly challenged by the emergence of a brutal and pervasive guerrilla conflict, which rendered their purported control of the Southern colonies tenuous at best. Charismatic partisan leaders, including Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, skillfully organized irregular forces. These units launched effective attacks on British supply lines, isolated garrisons, and loyalist militias. Their elusive nature made them exceptionally difficult to counter, as they expertly blended into the civilian population and possessed an intimate, strategic understanding of the local terrain. The guerrilla warfare in the Southern theater was marked by an unprecedented level of brutality, exceeding anything observed in the Northern campaigns. Both sides engaged in appalling atrocities against prisoners and civilians, painting a grim picture of the conflict. This struggle quickly devolved into a bitter civil war, tragically dividing communities and families as neighbors fought neighbors, and political loyalties tore apart even the closest kin. The strategic pivot in the Southern campaign arrived with the appointment of Nathaniel Greene as the commander of American forces in December 1780. Greene, a highly trusted subordinate of Washington, introduced an innovative strategic approach, skillfully combining conventional military maneuvers with effective guerrilla tactics. Rather than seeking decisive pitched battles, Greene adopted a strategy of strategic retreat, coupled with persistent attacks on British supply lines and isolated positions. His resilient philosophy was encapsulated in his famous dictum, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." This adaptive methodology aimed to systematically wear down British forces through constant harassment, while diligently avoiding the kind of crushing defeat that had previously decimated American armies in the South. The effectiveness of Greene's strategic vision was powerfully demonstrated at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. There, Daniel Morgan skillfully led an American contingent to a brilliant tactical victory over Bonastre Tarleton's British Legion. Morgan's ingenious plan exploited the known tendency of militia to retreat, integrating their feigned withdrawal into a sophisticated tactical maneuver that cunningly drew the British into a devastating trap. This engagement stands as a textbook example of how a numerically inferior force, through superior tactics and astute leadership, can achieve a decisive triumph over a superior enemy. The victory at Cowpens was succeeded by a series of engagements that progressively diminished British strength in the South. Greene confronted Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, where, despite a technical defeat, he inflicted such heavy casualties upon the British that Cornwallis was compelled to abandon his North Carolina campaign. Cornwallis famously remarked after the battle that another such victory would ruin the army, a testament to the devastating cost of his nominal triumph. Cornwallis's strategic decision to move his army to Virginia in the spring of 1781 was predicated on his belief that the Southern colonies could not be brought to heel as long as Virginia continued to furnish the American cause with essential men and materiel. This relocation also underscored Cornwallis's mounting frustration with the tenacious guerrilla warfare in the Carolinas, where British battlefield victories consistently failed to translate into effective political control over the populace. The Virginia campaign pitted Cornwallis against the Marquis de Lafayette, a remarkably young French volunteer who had earned his place as one of Washington's most trusted subordinates. Though barely old enough to vote, Lafayette had been sent to Virginia with a modest force to counter British raids, finding himself embroiled in a strategic game of cat and mouse with Cornwallis's significantly larger army. Lafayette's prudent strategy involved avoiding direct battle while persistently harassing British operations, a wise approach given his forces were outnumbered by an approximate 3-to-1 margin. Cornwallis's operations in Virginia initially met with success, as British forces conducted widespread raids across the state, compelling the Virginia government to flee from Richmond to Charlottesville. These British incursions disrupted American supply lines and starkly demonstrated the vulnerability of Virginia's plantation economy to military attack. However, Cornwallis soon realized that establishing lasting control over territory in Virginia was just as formidable a challenge as it had been in the Carolinas. He could secure battlefield victories and occupy towns, but genuine political authority over a hostile population remained beyond his grasp. The decision that would ultimately seal Cornwallis's fate came when he received orders from General Clinton to establish a fortified base on the Virginia coast, designed for supply and reinforcement by the Royal Navy. Cornwallis selected Yorktown a modest tobacco port on the York River, as his operational base. At the time, this choice seemed entirely logical. Yorktown featured a good harbor, was readily defensible, and promised to serve as a strategic hub for future military initiatives. Unfortunately for Cornwallis, this seemingly advantageous location would transform into an inescapable trap. The opportunity to ensnare Cornwallis at Yorktown emerged from a rare, fortuitous alignment of American and French forces. Washington, who had been planning an assault on New York, learned that a French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean, possessing sufficient strength to challenge British naval supremacy in the Chesapeake Bay. If de Grasse could secure control of the waters around Yorktown, Cornwallis would be cut off from any seaborne reinforcement or evacuation, rendering him vulnerable to a decisive siege. Washington's decision to march south to Virginia instead of attacking New York proved to be one of the war's most crucial strategic maneuvers. This arduous march demanded impeccable timing and seamless coordination between American and French forces, operating hundreds of miles apart with no reliable communication channels. It was akin to meticulously planning a surprise party where half the guests had to traverse a continent and arrive precisely on schedule, though the consequences of failure in this military endeavor were immeasurably graver than merely a ruined celebration. The march to Yorktown represented a logistical masterpiece, powerfully demonstrating the Continental Army's significant maturation since the war's initial stages. Washington and his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, moved their combined armies over 400 miles in less than a month, meticulously maintaining secrecy about their destination until they were beyond effective British interception. This complex operation also necessitated crossing several major rivers and coordinating closely with French naval forces, all while diligently sustaining army supplies and morale. The siege of Yorktown commenced on September 28, 1781, when the combined American and French armies, totaling approximately 17,000 men, successfully encircled Cornwallis's force of about 8,000 British and German troops. The siege unfolded according to the classic European pattern, involving the methodical advancement towards enemy fortifications through a series of parallel trenches, protected by continuous artillery bombardments. This systematic approach rendered the defenders' situation increasingly dire and miserable, epitomizing a slow, deliberate form of warfare that prioritized meticulous engineering over individual heroic feats. The paramount factor in the siege was Admiral de Grasse's decisive control of the Chesapeake Bay, which effectively prevented the Royal Navy from either reinforcing or evacuating Cornwallis's army. The French fleet had secured this vital naval supremacy by defeating a British naval force at the Battle of the Capes on September 5, 1781. This engagement, despite being characterized by extensive maneuvering and limited direct combat rather than dramatic spectacle, stands as one of the most significant naval battles in American history, its enormous consequences irrevocably sealing Cornwallis's fate at Yorktown. The siege operations at Yorktown were conducted in adherence to the formal rules of 18th-century warfare, with both sides observing traditional courtesies even amidst their deadly conflict. The Allied forces gradually advanced their trenches closer to the British fortifications, meticulously protected by fascines and gabions that provided crucial cover from enemy fire. This labor was inherently dangerous and exhausting, yet it proceeded with methodical precision and predictability. The conduct of the siege followed the established standard patterns of the era, a testament to its systematic engineering. The critical turning point in the siege arrived with the Allied capture of 2 British redoubts that anchored the outer defensive line, enabling them to position their artillery close enough to render the British position untenable. The daring assault on these redoubts was famously led by Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, offering these 2 future American political rivals an early opportunity to share military glory before their eventual disagreements over fiscal policy. The successful capture of these strongholds, achieved with relatively light casualties, powerfully underscored the effectiveness of the Allied siege operations. Cornwallis's situation became utterly hopeless when a relief expedition from New York was severely delayed by adverse weather and insufficient coordination. General Clinton had indeed assembled a fleet and an army specifically to rescue Cornwallis, but this expedition did not set sail until October 19, 1781, the very day Cornwallis officially surrendered at Yorktown. This timing was tragically ironic, akin to arriving at a party just as everyone else was departing, though in this case, the party was a military disaster, and its profound consequences signaled the potential loss of an empire. The surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, was executed with all the solemn ceremony required by 18th-century military protocol. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his second-in-command to present his sword to Washington, who, in a symbolic gesture, directed him to surrender it to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. The British troops then marched out of their fortifications, colors cased, while their bands famously played "The World Turned Upside Down," a choice that historians continue to ponder as either remarkably appropriate or a striking coincidence. The crucial moment arrived with the complete surrender of Lord Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown, a monumental triumph that American strategists had relentlessly pursued throughout the protracted conflict. This significant military setback, involving the forfeiture of approximately 8,000 British soldiers, coupled with the profound emotional and strategic blow it delivered, fundamentally extinguished any remaining British aspirations of achieving victory through armed confrontation. Furthermore, this pivotal success unequivocally showcased the formidable efficacy of the burgeoning Franco-American military partnership and underscored the viability of executing sophisticated European-style siege operations on American soil, provided that optimal environmental and tactical prerequisites were met. Upon receiving the dire dispatches from Yorktown in November of 1781, reports circulated that Prime Minister Lord North, upon learning of the catastrophe, famously uttered, "Oh God, it is all over." Such an anguished outburst was likely characteristic of the profound dismay experienced by many British government figures, who, in their strategic calculations, had been anticipating reports of Cornwallis's successful maneuvers in the Virginia theater, rather than the shocking intelligence of his utter annihilation and subsequent apprehension. While the decisive triumph at Yorktown did not instantly bring the hostilities to a close, it unequivocally signaled to all participants that the British strategic approach had utterly collapsed, necessitating the pursuit of a diplomatic resolution. The intervening period between the Yorktown victory and the official cessation of armed conflict was marked by a steady de-escalation of military engagements and the nascent stages of peace talks. Though British forces retained control over key port cities such as New York, Charleston, and Savannah, They refrained from initiating any significant new offensive campaigns. Conversely, the American forces were content to sustain their military presence, allowing their diplomatic representatives ample time to meticulously craft the specifics of a comprehensive peace accord. This phase resembled the final bell of a prize fight where, despite both combatants remaining on their feet, the clear victor had already been determined in the eyes of all observers. The ensuing peace negotiations were inherently intricate, primarily due to the conflict's escalation into a truly global confrontation, encompassing numerous European powers, each harboring distinct geopolitical aspirations. France, for instance, sought to diminish Great Britain's imperial influence, but harbored reservations about the nascent United States accumulating excessive power. Spain, on the other hand, was primarily motivated by the desire to reclaim Gibraltar and to curb any westward territorial ambitions of the newly forming American nation. Britain's objective was to mitigate its considerable losses and potentially sow discord between America and its European confederates. The entire diplomatic process mirrored a profoundly intense, high-stakes poker game, where each participant meticulously endeavored to ascertain the strategic hand held by their counterparts. The American delegation dispatched for peace discussions, comprised of the astute Benjamin Franklin, the resolute John Adams, and the sagacious John Jay, demonstrated exceptional diplomatic acumen. They successfully negotiated a settlement whose provisions far surpassed the most optimistic expectations held by many at the war's outset. The Provisional Peace Agreement, formally endorsed in November 1782, not only unequivocally acknowledged American sovereignty, but also delineated the Mississippi River as the definitive western frontier of the burgeoning United States, and further bestowed upon Americans vital fishing entitlements in the lucrative waters off the Newfoundland coast. This outcome was akin to experiencing the exhilaration of winning a grand lottery prize, having purchased a ticket with lingering doubts about its very legality. The Treaty of Paris, formally executed on September 3, 1783, served as the official conclusion to the American Revolution, thereby inaugurating the United States as a sovereign and independent nation. This monumental accord reaffirmed all stipulations outlined in the earlier preliminary agreement and mandated the complete withdrawal of all British military contingents from American soil. The signing of this treaty represented the grand culmination of 8 arduous years of conflict, a period that had irrevocably transformed 13 British colonial possessions into a self-governing republic. Nevertheless, the subsequent endeavor of actually constructing and solidifying this new nation would ultimately present challenges nearly as formidable as the struggle for independence itself. The departure of British forces from New York City on November 25, 1783, symbolized the definitive cessation of the American Revolution. General George Washington, leading the Continental Army, made his triumphant entry into the metropolis, at last realizing an objective that had frustratingly eluded his grasp since the calamitous military operations of 1776. This significant evacuation transpired without incident. British troops systematically embarked on ships, ceding authority as American soldiers seamlessly assumed command of the urban center. The entire event bore a striking resemblance to the conclusion of an exceedingly protracted and costly eviction proceeding, with the notable distinction that, in this historical drama, the long-term occupants had been actively engaged in combat against their landlords for nearly a decade. General Washington's poignant farewell address to his assembled officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York, delivered on December 4, 1783, represented a deeply emotional juncture, powerfully underscoring the profound personal connections and camaraderie that had been painstakingly forged throughout the arduous campaign for independence. Washington's subsequent choice to relinquish his military commission and retreat to the quietude of private citizenship was regarded as extraordinary by European commentators, who were historically accustomed to victorious military leaders exploiting their armed forces to usurp political authority. This voluntary surrender of immense power by Washington established a foundational precedent, one that would prove indispensable for the flourishing trajectory of American democratic governance. The toll exacted by the American Revolution in human lives was undeniably immense, although precise casualty statistics remain challenging to ascertain, largely owing to incomplete historical documentation and the broad inclusion of irregular militia units, non-combatant civilians, and allied combatants. Historical scholars generally estimate that roughly 25,000 Americans perished over the course of the conflict, encompassing both uniformed personnel and civilian populations, from a total populace then numbering approximately 2.5 million individuals. The British and their various allies endured comparable losses, while the financial expenditure associated with the protracted warfare proved staggering for all factions engaged. This period in history might be likened to the most exorbitant dispute ever waged, distinguished by the fact that the core contention revolved around foundational tenets of governmental structure and inalienable human entitlements. The societal and financial repercussions stemming from the Revolution were no less profound than its political transformations. The extensive conflict profoundly disrupted established social strata, simultaneously generating novel avenues for upward social movement and fundamentally challenging entrenched preconceptions concerning authority and societal distinctions. The very discourse of egalitarianism and inherent human rights, which had served as the intellectual bedrock for the Revolution, also inevitably brought to the forefront pressing inquiries regarding the institution of slavery, the entitlements of women, and the equitable treatment of indigenous Native American populations. While these intricate issues would not achieve comprehensive resolution for many subsequent decades, the revolutionary epoch metaphorically represented the unsealing of a portal to myriad fresh potentialities, even if the actual journey through that threshold proved to be a protracted and gradual undertaking. The far-reaching influence of the American Revolution transcended the geographical confines of the nascent United States. The triumphant insurrection against British monarchical authority ignited and fueled democratic aspirations across the European continent and throughout Latin America. While the foundational tenets eloquently expressed within the Declaration of Independence served as an exemplary framework for subsequent movements striving for self-determination, the Revolution also powerfully illustrated that subjugated colonial populations possess the capacity to effectively oppose formidable European imperial forces, a revelation that would carry immense ramifications for the global trajectory of colonialism. Furthermore, the establishment of the United States generated considerable geopolitical shifts, introducing a formidable new entity in North America, destined to eventually contest European hegemony across the Western Hemisphere. Seminal events such as the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, and the ultimate territorial expansion to the Pacific seaboard all found their genesis in the hard-won independence secured during the Revolutionary period. The United States that emerged from the crucible of revolution, though initially modest in size and comparatively feeble when measured against established European powers, harbored an immense latent capacity for demographic and territorial expansion. The enduring legacy of the American Revolution persistently shapes the political landscape and cultural identity of the nation. More than 2 centuries subsequent to the decisive engagement at Yorktown, core tenets such as limited governmental authority, the safeguarding of individual liberties, and the foundational concept of popular sovereignty, meticulously enshrined during the Revolutionary era, continue to occupy a pivotal position within contemporary American political discourse, even as their nuanced interpretation and practical implementation undergo perpetual evolution. Moreover, the Revolution meticulously crafted a compelling national narrative, one that prominently accentuates motifs of liberty, egalitarianism, and unwavering defiance against autocratic rule. While the empirical realities of American history have frequently diverged from these lofty ideals, the strategic military insights gleaned from the American Revolution were meticulously examined by military strategists and field commanders for generations following the cessation of hostilities. The effective deployment of irregular guerrilla warfare tactics, the critical imperative of cultivating widespread public endorsement for military endeavors, and the inherent complexities of prosecuting a conflict within an adversarial geographical context, all became central subjects of rigorous military analysis. Furthermore, the Revolution conspicuously illustrated the indispensable value of international diplomatic partnerships and underscored the pivotal, often decisive influence that naval superiority could exert upon the ultimate resolution of land-based military campaigns. The ultimate triumph of the American Revolution stemmed from its masterful synthesis of sustained military opposition, sophisticated political infrastructure, astute international diplomacy, and broad-based popular endorsement, a combination that rendered a British victory utterly unattainable. Notwithstanding Great Britain's formidable and undeniable superiority in both military and naval capabilities, the American colonists demonstrated remarkable tenacity, maintaining their resistance for a duration sufficient to render the conflict prohibitively costly and politically untenable for Britain to prosecute further. Simultaneously, they adeptly secured crucial foreign assistance, which ultimately facilitated the achievement of a decisive victory. This prolonged struggle bore a striking resemblance to prevailing in a marathon by sheer endurance and resilience, rather than by outright speed, with the notable distinction that this particular marathon spanned 8 grueling years and was punctuated by the thunderous roar of artillery. The profound metamorphosis of the American colonies, transitioning from loyal British subjects to self-governing citizens, constituted far more than a mere political alteration. It represented a fundamental psychological shift that engendered an entirely novel consciousness of national identity. The collective ordeal of the Revolution, encompassing its myriad privations, profound sacrifices, and eventual glorious victory, played an instrumental role in forging a cohesive American identity, one that effectively transcended pre-existing regional distinctions and diverse cultural affiliations. Consequently, the Revolution not only brought forth a new sovereign state, but also cultivated a distinct populace, individuals who perceived themselves primarily as Americans, rather than merely as transplanted Europeans. The economic ramifications of the Revolution presented a complex tableau, wherein the newly acquired independence introduced both burgeoning opportunities and formidable obstacles. The fledgling nation gained the liberty to engage in commerce with any global partner, unfettered by the previous constraints of exclusive trade within the British Empire. However, this newfound freedom also entailed the forfeiture of the protective umbrella provided by British mercantile and naval might. Furthermore, the protracted conflict had accumulated colossal national debts, a financial burden that would continue to vex American fiscal stability for many ensuing decades. While the rupture of established trade routes undoubtedly fostered a period of economic uncertainty, the attainment of independence was akin to severing ties from an affluent yet domineering marital partner. Profoundly liberating, but inherently fraught with intricate financial complications. The Revolution also had profound and often dire ramifications for the various Native American peoples, who suddenly found themselves confronting a nascent nation demonstrating an even more aggressive and unyielding drive for territorial expansion towards its western frontiers than the former British imperial power had ever exhibited. Many indigenous tribes had strategically allied themselves with the British Crown throughout the protracted conflict, harboring a fervent hope that a British triumph would effectively curb the relentless encroachment of American settlers into their ancestral domains. However, the eventual American victory irrevocably altered this geopolitical landscape, signifying that these communities now faced an inimical administration in Washington, D.C., an entity that displayed scant regard for upholding antecedent covenants or acknowledging the inherent sovereignty over indigenous ancestral lands. The profound and deeply entrenched question of human bondage, an issue conspicuously sidestepped or deliberately deferred throughout the revolutionary struggle, despite its glaring inconsistency with the foundational tenets of liberty articulated in the Declaration of Independence, escalated into an ever more vexing conundrum in the immediate post-war epoch. A segment of the American populace, predominantly residing in the nascent republic's northern territories, perceived the revolution as a providential moment to completely abolish the institution of chattel slavery, aligning national practice with stated ideals. Conversely, other citizens, particularly those entrenched in the agrarian economy and social hierarchy of the southern states, viewed any attempts to dismantle slavery as an existential peril to their established way of life. Although the Revolution had eloquently proclaimed the self-evident truth of universal human equality, it would ultimately necessitate a subsequent, devastating civil conflict to definitively ascertain whether that lofty principle genuinely extended its protective embrace to all individuals dwelling within the newly formed United States. While the American Revolution undeniably laid foundational cornerstones for a republican form of governance, pioneering seminal models that would profoundly shape the trajectory of political development across the globe, it simultaneously engendered complex dilemmas that the fledgling nation would subsequently grapple with for generations. The intricate interplay and inherent friction between central federal authority and individual state prerogatives, the burgeoning emergence and evolving function of partisan factions within the nascent political landscape, the safeguarding of liberties for marginalized groups, and the fundamental inherent constraints and boundaries upon popular rule were all profound issues that were born from the crucible of independence, but remained stubbornly unsettled by its conclusion. In essence, the revolutionary epoch was akin to penning the inaugural segment of an expansive, multi-volume chronicle detailing the arduous journey of democracy and the intricate art of self-government. The formal diplomatic endorsement and global acknowledgement of American independence constituted a signal achievement on the world stage, a monumental diplomatic coup that firmly ensconced the fledgling republic as a bona fide participant within the global fraternity of sovereign states. However, this hard-won legitimacy concurrently ushered in an array of novel obligations and formidable hurdles. The newly sovereign nation was now compelled to meticulously craft an independent stance on global affairs, formulate its distinct approach to international relations, assiduously forge formal diplomatic ties with other established powers, and steadfastly safeguard its national prerogatives and economic interests, all while unshielded by the formidable might of its former imperial overlord, the British Empire. While independence undoubtedly granted America the autonomy to chart its own course and make sovereign decisions, it concomitantly imposed the inescapable burden of bearing the full brunt of the repercussions stemming from those choices. At its very core, the American Revolution transcended the mere severance of colonial ties with Great Britain. It represented a quest for something far more profound: the pioneering establishment of an innovative governmental paradigm predicated upon the foundational principle of popular sovereignty, deriving its just powers from the legitimizing assent of the governed, and committed to the vigorous safeguarding of inherent human liberties. The triumphant outcome of this audacious venture in self-government was destined to unleash far-reaching ramifications, not solely for the inhabitants of the fledgling United States, but also for countless individuals around the globe who were then contending with despotic rule and systemic subjugation. Indeed, the revolution demonstrated unequivocally the capacity of common citizens to exercise self-rule, a profoundly subversive notion in an historical epoch still largely dominated by autocratic sovereigns and entrenched noble elites clinging to aristocratic privilege. The comprehensive narrative of the American Revolution ultimately serves as a profound testament to the transformative potency of ideological conviction to reshape global landscapes. The colonial inhabitants, initially articulating their grievances against particular imperial enactments and taxation without representation, ultimately culminated their efforts in the forging of an entirely novel republic, meticulously founded upon the foundational doctrines of freedom, universal parity, and popular autonomy. These revolutionary tenets were destined to ignite and fuel subsequent struggles for democratic governance for generations hence. From the very first organized protests against British fiscal policies to the final, unequivocal establishment of American independence, it unfolded as an arduous, intricate, and frequently savage conflict that transmuted a baker's dozen of British colonial dependencies into the United States of America, thereby creating both a new sovereign entity and an unprecedented governmental framework destined to indelibly alter the trajectory of global events. The revolution unequivocally demonstrated the capacity of common citizens to effectively oppose the preeminent global superpower of its era when they were championing cherished ideals they held sacrosanct, a timeless precept that continues to resonate with profound contemporary significance. A notable occurrence is unfolding today, drawing considerable scrutiny and becoming a central topic of discussion. This particular happening, while its precise nature and full implications are still being thoroughly examined, has asserted itself as a prominent focal point within the ongoing daily narrative. It undeniably represents a moment of significant contemporary relevance, prompting widespread contemplation and meticulous analysis across diverse sectors of society. Its immediate and undeniable presence underscores the inherently dynamic and often unpredictable character of current affairs, unequivocally positioning it as a noteworthy subject for deep consideration and extensive public discourse throughout the entirety of the present day.